Welcome to another Founder Wisdom Pod with Ken Stearns. Ken is the founder at thejar.works, the enabling company as well. He's a public speaker and an author for himself. He likes to talk about leadership, employee engagement, and employee flourishment, which is a nice word in itself.
Mm.
He's a podcast host too. So we're gonna have a pretty easy/good time today. He's worked at Prudential for quite some time, company that I studied. He worked in Hong Kong for some time too. So sales guy, I guess. And yeah, these days in Asia, selling stuff must have been pretty fun and hardcore. I'd picture certainly some type of Wall Street culture there, which a lot of people
As
hate upon, but I like it's some parts of it, right? This podcast is brought to you by podpire.com. That's my podcasting company. If you want to start or scale or monetize a podcast, you can go to podpire.com. Ken, welcome to the pod. Tell me a bit more about yourself and what you're up to nowadays.
Charles, thanks so much. Yeah, great. As you read the background for me, it kind of also, reminds me, holy cow, it's been a crazy, I'm 62 and I'm starting my third chapter in life here. And I had a crazy time in Asia. I lived in 5 countries. I lived in the largest Hindu country, the largest Muslim country, the largest Buddhist country, obviously American largest Christian country, I believe. And I've also lived in countries with no religion. And so it was a fantastic experience over in Asia. And then, like you said, also just crazy time of expansion and growth for the financial industry from 2000. They opened up the markets. So it was the wild, wild west. And just, hiring people, growing them, investing in people and moving around and just kind of, troubleshooting and having fun. And a couple of years ago, it's time to come home and make it back and start this third chapter. And that was the jar where I've traveled around. I went to 96 cities in the US in the last 2 years and interviewed 323, 26 people. And 300 plus shows up already and producing the last couple. It's been a wild last couple of years, rocking into people's homes with the jar and hearing their story.
That's pretty cool. What kind of people, by the way, high performers or folks from many walks of life?
Yeah, it was one of the things I wanted to do or I didn't want to do was I didn't want to curate the guests. I wanted it to be a very natural experience. And so we would do a post. We would boost a post in Facebook. And so we would just say, hey, Seattle, Washington, be a guest on the jar. The jar is coming to your city. Be a guest. Click here to find out more. And we would just chit chat with, it was first come, first serve. And so you can imagine all kinds of people. It was a very, I never knew who I was going to see. I didn't really read, until the last 100 people. I really didn't research who was making it through the list, and I would just show up like the audience. So when you tune in, I'm really just getting to know the person, just like the audience.
It's very interesting. You're actually giving me ideas. I wanted to do that concept when I was a nomad and traveling the world.
Hmm.
Not sure why I never pulled the trigger on it, but yeah, I'm definitely gonna sponsor some Facebook ads, probably yeah, lead gen type. They can fill in their info and fill in a couple of questions. Then how do you filter people that are interesting or not? What's your process there?
Yeah, it was first come, first serve. So, you know, I relied on this is I think the genius that I didn't, it wasn't geniusly designed, but it just happened to be genius in the end, it was really all about the questions. And probably my most painful parts, Charles, if I look back, if I would have done it differently, perhaps, and I tried to do this time in, different times, but I would open the first 30 minutes or 20 minutes, try to control it to 15, 20 minutes of the person telling their own kind of personal story, a little background. So you'd get to know the person. And then we'd get into these jar questions. And the jar would like peel that person open, right? It would tell some other parts of their life story. So people aren't typically great storytellers, and especially when it comes to their own life, unless they're professional and something they do all the time. And as a podcaster, you probably see this. It's not easy for people to tell their own story with some, decent track without losing themselves in a rabbit hole. And the questions really did that. And also, I wasn't an interviewer. I did something similar in life and corporate life, but I wasn't a sit down and interview somebody. So I designed the jar for the questions more for me to be a crutch for me, but it turned out to be very clever way for people to tell their story or what they believed in and felt.
Love that. Yeah, I think you're somewhat right with the story part. Can't compare myself on that level because I think I've got a fun story. Yeah, plus I've told it a bunch of times.
Yes.
With the jars though, like, I mean, I can see if you're not filtering people, why it might get interesting because every humans have a different background and they have a
Mm,
fun story. Often when I get guests on this pod that and I get bored, I think it's mostly stuff that I'm posing on myself, although I want to get like more high performers and I know my audience and I want to specialize in that. Yeah, just I sometimes dream of, a Neuralink that could connect me with other individuals and know instantly, their stories
oh,
with
yeah.
images and,
Yes.
their strong defeats and challenges. Do you feel that your podcast has been somewhat successful at getting this out of your guests? And then how do you face the challenge with poor communicators that even
Yeah.
though they have a cool stories, they can't communicate it well enough?
So the questions in the jar, I wrote a book called Dear God, and it's a kind of a spiritual it's a spiritual reconciliation or something. I kind of hard struggled with what the exact way to describe the book. It's not a religious book. I'm not a Christian. I'd never be able to speak in front of Christians as a Christian. I don't definitely qualify. I'm not an atheist. So the book is somewhere in between. After seeing all these religions and everything, I believe everything about religion and nothing, about it all at the same time. Um, so I wrote these letters, 48, basically 12 topics. And it was like, Dear God, isn't this what this is about? And so the topics were, I call the first part of it yourself, and that's your yesterdays, your todays, your tomorrows. And then the next three parts of the book was you and another person. So like between you and I, great humanistic thing is acceptance, forgiveness, and compassion. And if you kind of go one circle out to all people, then it was love, karma, and service. Have a loving heart, leave people and things better than you find them, and to go out with a service heart, a service mind, for humanity, and try to find those places where you can be of service to people. And then the last one is faith, hope, and prayer, which is kind of that, your relationship with whatever on the spectrum of whatever spiritual language you would use, meditation, prayer, mindfulness, the universe, whatever you would kind of call God. And so those parts, those really peel back a person. And so it's just 12 topics, but there's 444 questions. So there's a lot of facets to each one. And then each person interprets the question differently. So there's not 444, there's 4 million questions in a way. And and so that, when people read the question, they really internalize it and they use it as a launch pad to tell part of their story. And so that was the kind of the when as I sat back and listened, I never got bored, Charles. There was no interview where I was ever bored. I was always fascinated by those two things. How they interpreted the question was one, because I wrote them from a very specific pair of shoes, right? When I wrote the question, I didn't intend it to be interpreted. So I got surprised on that part. So people were interpreting the question. I went like, that's not the question. And then I realized, oh, that is the question to them. And then of course their own life experience came through.
Any examples of these questions?
Sure. I got a jar right in front of me. And we're on audio only or are we video?
Both, yeah.
Okay. So, I got the big jar here. I commissioned the jars with a gentleman I met in Indonesia. I met a guy 20 years before I needed him. If you believe in the universe, I met an individual, and when I was designing the name of the the show, and I came up with the jar, I was like, oh, the jar. It's going to be called the jar because the questions are in the jar. And then this guy I met said, oh, I envision a custom jar. It's a marketing friend. And so I immediately knew I had to call this guy, this glass blower I met in Bali. And we turned out we met in San Francisco because of COVID. And away we went. There we were. And San Francisco making 4 jars, beautiful pieces of work. So here, I'll just read a few, right? I'll just kind of rapid fire. How well do you know your mother? Is it possible to teach self-love? Have you ever felt despair? Was there a time you needed a compassionate soul and they appeared? How do you decide who is and who is not in your tribe? How can we help people open their hearts? And the last kind of sample is, do you change around different people or are you always the same? So just a little sampling of the different kinds of questions. And those will all come from one of those topics, right? They're all a facet or an angle on the topics.
How did you get the inspiration to come up with these? They're great questions.
You think, first off, thanks. And second part is this mystery of, I know it's a creative process. And sometimes, when you're in that, late at night, I'd written the book and I mean, so I'll back up a little bit. So I'd written the book and these ideas were coming together, coming back to the US, traveling. I wanted to be a public speaker was my ultimate goal, and how to build, some brand. And so, these ideas swirling around in your head. And I had 6 whiteboards drilled into my hallway wall. And so I was just writing ideas up and racing ideas. I'd stand there at night for 2, 3 hours, and through the kind of that creative process, I ended up coming with the idea that, oh, the questions should come from my book. And so then it was a matter of going back and putting up a page of every letter, the 40. So each, like, for example, love. It's, the letters that I wrote, asking God my ideas, I'm kind of checking in. I'm like, hey, God, isn't loving yourself the most important love? Like, don't I have to love myself first? And only then, and the second letter is, then I can love somebody else. And if I can truly love somebody else, I can't love somebody else purely without self-love, was my premise. And then I can love somebody else. Then I can receive love. You can't really receive love if you don't love yourself. It's impossible to break through that. Somebody can love on you a ton, but if you haven't reconciled the self-love, you can't fully accept it, and nor can you believe it to be true because you're not even worthy yourself. And then the last one is, if you've got those 3 pretty well down, and of course there's, we're not always in a perfect state with all 3 at the same time, you can teach love. You can show another person what love is. You can teach children what love is, mostly, and other people who have lost, the ability to love themselves or to love somebody else. And so, sitting down with each chapter, each letter, and then trying to find 8 to 10 questions in there that I would want to ask people to validate what I thought was true.
Love that. I just finished checking your Instagram pictures. They're really beautiful images, and yeah, I like the style that you take. Sometimes it's parts, sometimes it's dogs, sometimes it's children. So really interesting. And you've been doing that for the past 9 years, quite literally.
Yeah, I
So
I
cool
I still love.
passion.
Thanks about the insight. I really appreciate that, Charles, because I spend a lot of time carrying a camera around in Asia. And I'd get up early, go to market. You can see I have a lot of market photos and just people photos across different countries, and just the human spirit. I think I try to capture the human spirit in those.
It's just And you've spent a lot of time in Asia and such a different culture. For example, I was checking the scorpions, right? Like here in Mexico, we eat crickets, right? But
Yeah.
in scorpions, that's next level. I tried to capture them and have them as pets, here in this house. The
Yeah.
last one didn't survive. Um, but no, it's just fascinating that you're traveling around, and I also watch the development of your van. So now you literally have a van in which you travel in with all your equipment and
Yes.
you travel throughout the state. So do you stay in Airbnbs? Like, what's the plan and the usefulness of the van?
Yeah, it was really to carry stuff and to be a big marketing, big banner. And I never intended to live in it. So I've Airbnbs and hotels for 2 years. I haven't everything, other interesting thing, Charles, is I have reduced my life to my personal belongings to about two suitcases and a box. And it's amazing. And I've had, fancy apartments in Asia with all kinds of furnishings and all kinds of accoutrements and things you need and things you want. And at the end, I'm able to live out of a suitcase, honestly. We don't need much in life to be happy.
Why not sleep in the van? Like, I see you don't have the bed set up there.
Yeah, I mean, living in a van is a whole different animal. And it's a full-time job living in a van, right? Waking up, cooking, cleaning, um, and the really surprisingly weird thing is the internet was one of the biggest deciders. There was no real way to, because I was filming every show and I was doing, 5 shows a week, 5 different in 2 cities a week almost. So uploading and downloading and doing all that, the production work was tremendously difficult, quite honestly. That was the part that really wore me down, was not having a big enough team, because I was creating a ton of content and difficult to manage.
Yeah, I guess 350 plus interviews that you've done, meeting logistically with people. I mean, here we're
Yes.
doing a Zoom. It's so easy, it's so streamlined and on autopilot. But what would I be missing out here? I guess the physical connection and, seeing someone and interacting with them. That's more like the human, the heartfelt part. Do you see what advantage you see in doing it via Zoom? And what disadvantage do you see in doing it online?
I mean, there's nothing like being in someone's home. That the jar was very personal. Questions are very deep and very personal. And so to go to someone's home and to do this, um, allowed them to be more, I think, more comfortable. Even, on a Zoom, I think it would never. I mean, I've done some questions in the Humanist podcast I do. We pull some questions for fun and we have fun with it. Um, and the answers are good. But honestly, listening, and I would spend sometimes, we'd have a 30-minute chat before we started. I I had dinner at I had one guest where they cooked dinner for me. The wife cooked dinner the first night, and I interviewed the guy, and I was at the house 4 hours. I came back the next night and interviewed the wife, and the husband cooked dinner. And I was there 4 or 5 hours, till like 11 o'clock at night, just getting to know them and being welcomed into their home. And I saw, I've been in halfway houses where people were, where they wanted to tell their story. And so I've been in halfway houses with no furniture. We did the interview on the floor, guys just barely making it, coming out of some rough situation, all kinds of interesting people and all walks of life. Like I said, I almost never knew until I pulled up to the neighborhood what was going to happen. Hanging out with a guy making beer, you know, um, just some of the wildest. Meeting a guy at 8 in the morning. He had gotten up at 4 in the morning to make barbecue in Mississippi. Curtis Williams, some of the best barbecue I've ever had. Barbecued ribs at 8 in the morning, and he was there at 4 in the morning cooking for us.
Wow.
Just some real amazing humans out there. Humans are absolutely amazing. I have to say, forget what you see on TV, forget, the news, forget Twitter, forget Facebook, forget all the comments of trolls make behind computers. I didn't meet a bad person.
Wow. Yeah. Hmm. I love humans too. Yeah, I think the problem sometimes is trying to have a focus on my podcast. And when you're like not satisfied with something, most of the time you're not satisfied at yourself. So but
Hmm.
yeah, I'd love to do something similar to that because I also think that everyone has a story to share. But in your case, it's become like a full-time activity now, right? So,
Yeah.
um, do you interview one person a day? Like, what's your plan? Or do you enjoy it one day, then you do an interview the next? Like, what's your life like
Hmm.
nowadays?
Yeah. So I've paused the jar for a bit. When I got to California, the goal is to do 111 cities and 400 and ultimately 444 people is the target. So I'm still about 100 people short, and I'll start this back up, I think, in the fall. So right now I've taken a break. I'm going to work on my public speaking. So I want to get that started because I've got some stories to tell. I really want, I've got some wisdom, I think, to share. A little gray hair, so I've got a lot of fun stuff to share on the stage, and to hopefully leave people with some impact from the blessings of the stories that I've been able to get. So it's not really coming from me; it's really through me, and being able to tell other people's stories, and to package that in a way people can access it. So I'm working on that, but every day now I'm trying to do almost a podcast Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. I try to do either the humanist, where I'm in search of that flourishing. What is it like to flourish as a person, as a human, and then also I'm still doing, Charles, halfway through the Jar podcast, I started a podcast called Mental Health Today, and it was because I had seen really some hard stories, a lot of mental health stories in, being invited into people's homes, people that want to tell their story. A lot of these were tough, tough stories. Like, I mean, if you listen to some of the Jar stories, these are some people who have overcome some real hardships. And, these are the people standing next to you in the grocery store. It's the person checking you out. It's your waitress. I mean, you don't know people's stories. And you said it earlier, everybody has one. And some of these are tough. And I was shocked at the mental health crisis. Is what I saw. And so I started that to learn more about the mental health side. What are people doing around it? How's the industry doing it? And so I've got about 120 of those shows done, and really all mental health professionals. I paused that in December, but I've just started it back up. And I'm going to focus a bit on housing right now. The housing crisis and rental, and people getting kicked out, and the impact this has on mental health. So I've kind of got a little season two. So long answer, short answer is I'm trying to do about 4 or 5 shows a week between those two podcasts, but virtual. And like you said, man, by Zoom, it's a lot easier. It's a less heavy load.
And how do you fund all of that?
Well, I was fortunate. I earned a good bit of money in Asia, and I decided that I was going to take that money and invest it in myself, and fund the podcast and fund my life. So, one of the reasons I paused is, there is a limit to everybody's funding, and I got to that point where it was a little bit scary. I didn't see very difficult to see monetization on the jar, although there's a lot of opportunities, and I know there's value in there. I just haven't extracted that value. There's a lot of gold in there. I've got some incredible content, but hasn't been exposed or been lifted up yet. So that was one reason I paused it, to get the speaking business going again, earn some, get back to earning, to be, start filling up the reservoir again, and then find out how to invest it again. But really, I spent the last couple of years, I look at it as investing in myself and in my future. And now it's kind of go back and figure out how to leverage that.
Love everything that you're doing. Do you also do online editions
What do you mean?
like Zooms,
Yeah,
podcasts,
yeah.
but on
So
Zooms?
yeah, so the Mental Health Today and the Humanist are both virtual. So I'm doing those on StreamYard, basically a Zoom call, and I do those, virtual. So all my shows now are virtual. I haven't done anything physical since November.
Very interesting. So where can people find out more about you, Ken?
I think one is I think LinkedIn's a good place if you're a business person. You can find me on LinkedIn, Ken Stearns. Um, I think there's probably a few Ken Stearns, but I'm definitely Googleable. If you Ken Stearns, The Jar, I think is definitely you're gonna find me. Or you just go to thejar.live, www.thejar.live. And there's some links there as well to some of the other platforms that we're on.